um, called the Enlightenment. The various social thinkers of the day began to question the structure of European society. And I've mentioned this before, and I'll just try to be consistent in it, that depending on where you were, this could be either an incredibly intense debate, or it could be something on the distance that nobody's paying attention to. And so in France, Enlightenment philosophers were having a heyday talking about things that should change. The English were kind of in the discussion, but not looking for any major applications. And way over in Eastern Europe, the Tsar loved the way he was running things and wasn't about to make any changes. So this is an uneven distribution of ideas, but where it does take root, it has some pretty profound impacts. One of them is the United States of America. The leadership of the political leadership in the American colonies was steeped in some of this stuff, and became convinced that the best way to express these changes was to have a revolution and become a new country. In Europe, there begins a process not of new nation building, but rather of new inclusion. And so the Jews, who had been on the fringe for a millennia, suddenly find themselves being granted citizenship. And again, unevenly, England, Denmark, Holland, to some degree France, in certain places Germany, they would be welcomed in as citizens. Other places, again, not so much. And then along with that comes an idea, because an awful lot of the European countries in the 17 and 1800s were actually conglomerates of modern countries. So like if you were to look at a map in the 1780s or 1800s, there's no Poland. Or if it is listed, it's called the Duchy of Warsaw, and the Russians control it. There's no Slavic states. There's no Estonia, places like that. Czechoslovakia doesn't exist because it's part of the Austrian Empire. So, but there are definitely people groups, and these people groups begin to grab hold of this idea that they should have a say in what's going on. And in fact, in some places, the push is for not just identifying them as a people group within your empire, but they begin to agitate to let's take the empire apart and I should have my own country. And so you're going to find the roots of dependence. And in the countries that are empires, obviously the guy running the empire doesn't like this idea. So there's a lot of stress going on. But what's kind of interesting is even though the Jews have now become included in European culture, they're now being granted citizenship. They're being protected by the same laws that any citizen would be protected by. This idea of self-determination and taking a people group and identifying them by their culture, their history, their language, and giving them a nation births this thing in the Jewish community called Zionism. And the Zionist movement is percolating in the background of Jewish thinkers and Jewish communities, because even though they've been granted citizenship, they are still Jews and they maintain a level of separation from the larger society that they're in. All you have to do is go down to New York City and walk through the Hasidic section of the city, and those folks are Americans and they know their American rights, but they are Jews and they live separate from the community around them. In many ways, not too different than the Amish communities up here, okay? So this is not an unusual thing. But in the minds of the European leaders, they become suspicious. Weren't we just nice enough to you to include you in our political body? Didn't we just grant you citizenship and the protections of that? And yet the Jews are still, or not still, are starting to become active towards petitioning the global community for recognition as a nation state. And so there's this really strange event that's going to occur called the International Jew. And it's like the European leaders become suspicious of the fact that the European Jews aren't just happy with being citizens of their country. There's this international discussion amongst Jews, and obviously the Jews who are successful are recognized and wealthy. Like I said, the House of Rothschild's banking interests and things like that, they're incredibly powerful influentially through economic means, and so there's this suspicion that grows that maybe there's a conspiracy out there to, in fact, it's strange. It covers a spectrum of, there's a conspiracy out there that they're going to cut out part of Europe and make it Jewish, or they're going to overthrow our governments and make them Jewish. I don't know. It was a whole bunch of strange things. In the Middle East, though, because this is where the Jews, the Zionist Jews are looking. They're looking at their homeland, or their ancient homeland. And in the Middle East is the last of the great Muslim empires. I showed you a map where when Islam spread out from the Middle East, it literally reached from Spain into India. And depending on what snapshot of what part of a century, sometimes it was a unified organization, and then sometimes it was broken up into different Muslim kingdoms. The Ottoman Turkish Empire is the last large-scale Muslim empire in the Middle East. And there were now a number of other Muslim countries, Libya, Egypt, Algiers, Morocco. They are Muslim countries, in fact, Muslim kingdoms in many cases. But this is the last big, old-style empire, and the Turks have been around about 300, 400 years, okay? They had overthrown the Byzantine Empire and established themselves as a power broker in the Middle East, but centuries of being this powerful have also corrupted them. So Arab people groups who don't like being part of this Ottoman Turkish Empire. In fact, one specific powerful family is the House of Saud. And they're in Arabia. I wonder what kind of name they'll get when they finally come to power. Yeah, they are not happy having to live under under Turkish influence. They're all Muslims, but they don't necessarily like each other. Some 30-odd years ago, when the first Gulf War was on the horizon, I had a friend ask me, how accurate is the media presentation of pan-Arabism? Because there was this concern that if America went into the Middle East and picked a fight with Saddam Hussein, that all the Arab countries around there would join him against the United States and the European powers. And I said, not likely. They don't like each other, okay? The Kuwaitis don't like the Saudis don't like the Jordanians don't like the Lebanese. They don't like each other. They're just like the Europeans. Back when the French didn't like the Dutch and the Dutch didn't like the Germans. They're just people, and they're they're broken by the same thing that breaks all of humanity, sin. And so they are bound and determined to have their way or no way. It's amazing how quickly clumps of human beings can come to decisions that are really incredibly self-destructive because they just don't leave any room for negotiation. And the way the Turks had run their empire was very oppressive even to other Muslims. And so this particular group of Muslims, the Saud, House of Saud, were, which I won't go into all the threads and details and aspects, but it is a byproduct of this nationalism and this self-determinism. Within several of these empires, there were these movements to fight for independence. And in the process of fighting for independence, they triggered events that got out of hand really quickly. And those events provoked World War I. This map shows you three of the central powers, as they were called, because they were central to the storyline in the middle of Europe. You've got Germany, Austria, and then down in the bottom corner is just a little edge of the Turkish Empire. The rest of the Turkish Empire actually controls the Middle East. So if my map had been able to, that little tiny Turkish corner would be in the Middle East, down the Tigris-Euphrates River, down to the edge of Egypt. And so they were bigger than what they look like there. But the Germans and the Austrians had basically gotten into a fight with the Russians and the French, and in order to flank them on a strategic level, they invited the Turks to help. And what they were doing was actually inviting disaster, because both the Austrian Empire and the Turkish Empire were riddled with this kind of internal strife of subgroups looking to be recognized. So this war rages on for 4 years. It's a horrific event. Oh, Jason's not in here. If you really want to talk to somebody who geeks out on World War I now, talk to Jason Bast. He just loves it. I mean, I thought I was a geeky historian. He wins. So while this confrontation is going on, the British make an interesting commitment to the Jews, the international Jewish community. They will support the identification of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. You'll notice that name Palestine comes up. They don't say in Judea, they don't say in the Middle East, they say Palestine, because this is one of those Kleenex moments, you know? Everybody's got a facial tissue, it's called Kleenex. Well, actually, no, they're called facial tissues. Kleenex is a name brand. Well, the term Palestine that the Romans threw on this piece of property way back in the 3rd century has stuck. And now, if you look at a map of the Middle East that reflects kingdoms and empires before the birth of Christ, Judea is plainly listed in there. Sometimes it's the kingdom of Israel, sometimes it's Judea. But particularly after the Roman Empire, after the 500s, the maps will all say Palestine, because it's Roman maps that have survived. The Roman maps are the ones that everybody looks at. And so this land is called Palestine. By the way, the Jews don't have a knee-jerk reaction and say, oh, no, it's not Palestine. They go, okay, fine, we don't care, we just want to go home. It's called the Balfour Declaration. And the Zionist Jewish movement in Europe looks at this promise as a very, very specific commitment on the part of one of the world's greatest empires to back them up. And so the Jewish community, the wider Jewish community in Europe, gets very excited over this kind of support. Now, I'm going to have to shortcut a lot of this. In the long run, the Germans, the Austrians, and the Turks lose, okay? The war drags on for 4 years. It's a bloody mess. It's horrific beyond all horrificness. World War I, to this day, has the most MIAs, missing in action, listed soldiers of any war we've ever participated in. Because literally, the way we fought that war was a meat grinder, and human beings disappeared. They were shattered, buried, left on battlefields, and forgotten. The recent climate change has melted some of the glaciers in the Alps, and there was a battle line border between the Italians and the Austrians up in the mountains, and they've discovered hundreds of bodies of soldiers that went missing in the glaciers up there. So at least a few of the MIAs are coming home, but it's just a staggering thing. Because they lose the war, they're partitioned, okay? Which means they're cut up. The winners take the losers apart. And this includes Germany and Austria and Turkish Empire in the Middle East. Now, in Europe, you get places like Poland suddenly showing back up on a map. Czechoslovakia appears out of nowhere. Yugoslavia, which isn't really even a people group, it's a mix of groups, is sewn together. And the Europeans let those countries kind of build themselves. They don't get involved, okay? The British don't send troops to Czechoslovakia. The French don't send troops to Yugoslavia. In Europe, the newly partitioned lands are granted independence, and they have to fend for themselves. They have to figure this out. And honestly, they do a reasonably good job. In the Middle East, it's a different story. In the Middle East, the new countries or the new territories are going to get the help, quote unquote, of the European winners. So what you have is Britain and France look at these new countries that were cut up: Jordan, Lebanon, Kuwait, with the exception of Saudi Arabia. The deal that the British made with the House of Saud, since the House of Saud, we talk about tribes. This wasn't like 50 guys in tents in the desert, okay? This was hundreds of thousands. The House of Saud was a huge tribe in the Middle East, and they fought for the British against the Turks. And so the Brits granted them independence and recognized their territorial claims and didn't interfere past giving them some financial assistance. But everybody else got somebody to sit on them. So the British were in Egypt, the British were in Palestine, the French were in Lebanon, the French were in Syria, the British were in Kuwait. So it looks like they're there to help, but the real purpose is control the oil reserves. Everybody and their mother knows that the Middle East was full of oil. And this is now the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, and everything in the world lives off petroleum products. And so we're going to help you get yourself on your feet, and while we're here, we'll supervise your oil wells for you. You ever drive by a gas station that says BP? What's it stand for? British Petroleum. Britain doesn't have any oil wells. Where were they getting the oil? Oh, yeah, from these guys. It's one of the reasons why when Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait, it wasn't the Americans who actually led the United Nations effort to expel him. It was actually the British. The British petitioned the United Nations Council for military aid to Kuwait, and the Americans backed the British play. So it's because to this day, Kuwait has a mutual defense treaty with England. Now, I don't know what the Kuwaitis are going to do if England ever gets invaded, but definitely when Kuwait got invaded, the Brits were right there to help them out. So the British now have a controlling interest in the Middle East, and particularly in Palestine. Yet, in the decades after the war, suddenly some of the politicians in England got a little bit of cold feet. And they weren't necessarily as enthusiastic as they seemed to have been when they signed that Balfour Declaration. This was astoundingly frustrating to the European Jews. Let me just give you an example of what happened with the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So over here, this is the Ottoman Turkish Empire before the war. Turkey, Syria, Palestine, and you'll notice the French control Lebanon, Syria, the Brits control Saudi Arabia as an independent country. So just to give you a little idea of what the Middle East is looking like in the 1920s. So Britain is supervising Palestine. They've made this promise to support a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and yet they've kind of cooled on that. So what happens is the Zionist leadership begins to actively recruit massive immigration to Palestine, to the Jewish part of southern Palestine. And it's illegal. The British authorities want to control this flow, partially because they know the Zionists in Europe are very aggressive in their desire to create a nation. Truth be told, that the folks who lived there, okay, there's Arabs there, there's Muslims there, there's Jews there, they weren't always excited about seeing all these European Jews come in. Because the Jews who had lived in the Middle East all these centuries had learned how to stay under the radar, so to speak. They had survived under the thumb of multiple empires and kingdoms and jurisdictions, and they basically didn't want trouble. They were very much aware of what had happened to their brothers and sisters in other parts of the world being persecuted, and they had actually, in the Middle East, had lived reasonably well. These new Zionist Jews from Europe weren't having it. They wanted a homeland, and they were willing to agitate to get it. So it's odd, but some of the Jews in the Middle East didn't necessarily support this Jewish idea of the rabble-rousers showing up. The newcomers came with extremely focused nationalistic ideas because they were a product of European Enlightenment. They were a product of this self-determinism and things like that. So they were looking for a place to finally call home. And they believed they should have one. They believed that if they did get one, they'd be able to protect themselves better than when they were at the mercy of European governments. Because what was given by those European governments in terms of citizenship could just as easily be taken away. And they knew that. Long before Hitler passed the Nuremberg rules, and denied the Jews in Germany citizenship and made them an unnationalized group of people, the Jewish leadership in Europe said, hey, if they could give it to us, they can take it away. And so we need someplace. And so their activities were intense. Their activities were very aggressive, and that kind of troubled folks. Eventually, the British government said, look, we got to put a cork in this thing. And so they tried to limit immigration. They set up a whole bunch of red tape barriers that just made it incredibly difficult to get there. And they set up quotas. Now, even after World War II, the British control in the Middle East was going to be limited by these quotas. But after World War II, the thing that obviously had affected the world was the genocide that had occurred. And there's a great movie out there. It's called Exodus, but it's not about the book of Exodus. It's actually about the post-World War II movement of the Jewish leadership to create a state of Israel. And it's a great movie. It's a great movie. But it kind of, one aspect of it was how the Jews were getting around these limitations, these quotas, and in some cases they just basically, they basically loaded people up on a boat and ran the boat across the Mediterranean Sea without any registration, without any list of cargo, and then they beached it on the shores of Israel. And the people just jumped off and intermingled with the civilians. So there was a very aggressive desire on the part of the Jews in Europe to get to a homeland. And like I said, the genocide, 6 million Jews murdered in the concentration camps, really changed opinions in favor of the Jews. So even when the British went to the United Nations and asked for help, there was a level of sympathy on behalf of the Jews, and even some of the British allies. The Americans were like, "What are you going to do? Maybe just let them go." So support for a Jewish state became a tidal wave, became a very powerful moment in history. May of 1948, the United Nations finally grants and recognizes the state of Israel. And what they also did, which is not oftentimes talked about, is that they equally recognized a Palestinian Arab state. And the original outline of the Jewish mandate is the gray area that's here. And so Jerusalem and some of the surrounding areas was supposed to be kind of a neutral zone, but it was right in the middle of the Palestinian Arab state, which included a border region with Lebanon and a border region with Egypt and the Sinai. Those aren't the nicest borders to try to defend or to supervise. We are incredibly fortunate in that we have some reasonably well recognized borders, whether or not anybody's using them today, but we do have some reasonably easily recognized borders with the Canadians and even with the Mexican authorities down south. A border like that, could you imagine trying to rationalize how you're going to move through here or through here? For goodness sakes. I'm not exactly sure who threw the spaghetti on the wall to make that map, but wasn't necessarily the best design. So you've got a United Nations-backed state of Israel, and you've got a United Nations-backed Palestinian Arab state. There's several independent, by this time, independent Arab countries around them. Lebanon is to the north. Syria is to the north east, right there across the Sea of Galilee. You got Jordan along the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, and then you've got Egypt to the south. Okay, they're all Arab countries, and they did not support the existence of a Jewish state. So, quite literally, the morning after the declaration by the United Nations of an independent Jewish state, the Arab countries around there very much, and this is where I think Americans get the idea that the Arab states always work together, because they certainly work together at this point. They actually put out a political statement for the destruction of Israel. And they had been planning for it, okay? They weren't just sitting idly waiting for the United Nations to say it's peace. Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon had been actually marshaling military forces in support of the Palestinians, the Arab Palestinians in this part of the world, and had also been feeding weapons to the Arab Palestinians in this part. So within hours, the neighboring Arab states begin to attack Israel. And it is an astounding story right out of Old Testament biblical events. Outnumbered, outmanned, outgunned, the Jews not only defend themselves, but they quite literally throw back all these invading forces. And to read the stories about how this occurred, like I said, it borders on Old Testament hand of God intervention. Because we were such good folks as Americans, we had given the Israelis our leftover stuff from World War II. And hey, I'm not going to use it anymore. You might as well use it. So we gave them these old tanks. We gave them these old guns. They took on a lot of stuff of their own. And it is honestly, sometimes when I read this stuff, it's like God blinded the eyes of the enemy, and the Israelis were able to defeat them. This begins a period in Jewish history up to roughly last October, where there were a sequence and a series of planned attacks over the decades by Arab governments trying to destroy Israel. The War for Independence was in 48. That's what the Jews call that time frame. They were granted independence, they were attacked, they won. They call that the War of Independence. In 56, there was a second war. Again, Arab states conspired to destroy Israel, attacked Israel, were defeated and driven out. In 67, there was an amazing event called the Six-Day War. And in that one, the Jews were so successful that that's when they captured the West Bank of the Jordan River that had been Palestinian territory. It's that section right here. They also took much of the Sinai Peninsula away from Egypt. There's also been, and this is what has happened, like with what happened in October. I'm sorry, I missed one. 73, there was the Yom Kippur War, which was a sneak attack by Egypt and Syria. And again, there were moments where it looked like the Jews were going to collapse, and then things just changed. And they won, and they secured their borders, and they protected themselves. But in the background has been this growing issue of terrorist organizations. When it was thought that politically the Arab states would defeat Israel, there was some terrorist activity, there was some sabotage and things like that. But honestly, since it has become evident that the Jews can defend themselves and will defend themselves, the tendency has been for the last 40 years to go into these kind of clandestine terrorist organizations. Some of them you may not have heard from or heard of, but the Fedayeen were very, very, that was in the news all through the 60s. And then they kind of disappeared, and they were replaced by what was just shortly called the PLO. And for decades, the PLO was the harassing terrorist organization in the Middle East. But they also went after anybody that supported them. I remember a couple of times in high school reading about bomb blasts in airports in Europe because the PLO was targeting a country that was supporting Israel at the time. I also remember in high school having an opportunity to go to Europe. And we landed in Amsterdam before we flew into England. And in Amsterdam, the police walking the streets all had machine guns. And I thought, wow, they take their job seriously over here. But it's because it was one of those airports targeted by the terrorist organizations, the PLO particularly. And I thought to myself, boy, we are so safe in America for a minute. That all changed in my lifetime. Police officers had .38 caliber revolvers when I was a kid, and a set of handcuffs and a billy club. That's how they kept order in the streets. Now something goes down and you see an armored vehicle with SWAT written on the side, and the guys get out with rocket launchers and machine guns. Say, oh, we joined the Danes in defending ourselves. And they use their techniques against anybody that they can. Hezbollah is replaced. Well, the PLO actually made an agreement with Israel at one point, and because they made an agreement, a political agreement with Israel, I think they were abandoned by the hardcore terrorists. Hezbollah functions out of Lebanon, and the group that made the news in October, Hamas, functioned out of the Gaza Strip. And America has joined this activity. Most of us focus on 9/11 as the break point, but truth be told, if you look back and filter some things, starting in the 80s, the United States was targeted by terrorist organizations. It's just that it didn't happen on our soil, and so we kind of poo-pooed it. 2 American embassies were leveled in Africa by terrorist organizations sympathetic to the Arabs. But because only 6 Americans were killed, hundreds of local employees of the American government were killed, but didn't quite make it big on the evening news. There was a first attack on the trade towers, a car bomb in the basement, but it didn't work. And so we said, oh, look at that, a car bomb. And we kind of push off to the background until it seems to jump in our face, you know. So 9/11 was that jump in your face moment. And we and the world have become embroiled in this. You hear all kinds of strange things. After the October 7th attacks, you catch this little echo in the background. Well, they knew it was coming. Well, did you know that we knew Pearl Harbor was coming? Yeah. Yeah, we were actually tracking the Japanese fleet, and we had actually broken the Japanese code, and we knew they were going to declare war. We just didn't know where. But a war warning had actually gone out from Washington, D.C. to all of our extended military bases, and Pearl Harbor was one of them, except they didn't get ready. Because the guy that wrote the note from the Defense Department to the headquarters in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, put it on a sticky note that fell off the envelope. Absolutely. I would have used Scotch tape. Yeah. So when they say they knew about it, take that stuff with a grain of salt. They also knew that aliens were going to attack because they got that through their filtration system too, okay? I mean, oh my gosh. The kinds of things that they have to deal with in military intelligence, and then to pick one little pin out of the haystack and say, oh, look, I found it. It's a little silly. What do you make of this, you know? Because quite honestly, it can be disconcerting. Who's really in control of this whole show? You know the answer. God's in control. And it doesn't mean that Israel is always right, okay? There is not a government on the planet Earth that we have ever put together that's functioned to the complete peace and safety of anybody inside the country or outside of the country. Because God didn't tell us we were going to make peace with countries. He's going to be our peace. And much as I love my country, the United States and Israel are not righteous. One of the first things the government of Israel did when they won their war for independence in 48 and they gained control of several Palestinian regions, they turned right around and did to the Palestinians what had been done to them by the Nazis. Palestinians had to wear a badge to identify themselves as non-Jews. Now, what kind of a lesson did you learn while you were being persecuted in Germany? Do you think that's the answer? But leaving humans in charge of humans, pretty much a really good recipe for a history teacher to have something to talk about. It doesn't work. Winston Churchill said it best: democracy is the worst form of government ever devised by humans, other than all the other kinds we've tried. We're not going to bring peace to ourselves. It really is in the hands of God. So, I got a couple of scriptures that struck me here. What are we worried about? And I worry about lots of things other than Israel, but we do worry. And the Apostle Peter knew that back in the first century when he wrote a letter to the disciples of that era. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. And then John summed it up best at the end of Revelation. He who testifies to these things says, yes, I am coming soon. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus. The establishment of the the nation of Israel is one of those end-time signs. And so we should keep that in mind. Jesus' parable about the fruit tree, that when you see it leaf, you'll know what season is coming. We cannot find the day or the hour. Jesus says so himself. But we can always be ready. And I think every day gets us one day closer to that end. Just throw this out to you. That's the end of what I wanted to cover. Any questions or anything that I might not have touched on that you might want to ask for some clarification? Yeah. Yeah. My opinion is that their opinions are